In this screencast, we will develop an Ember.js component based on the Select2 JQuery plugin. So this plugin works as a select plugin, where we can create a predefined list of selectable items that we can select from the list. We can also type in to match the items we can select. And it's also possible to configure this component so that we can type in new keywords and add them via either comma or enter the return key. So we're going to develop a new Ember.js plugin or component based on this plugin here. So we're going to be using Ember CLI. So before I started, I installed Ember CLI, which you can install by going to embercli.com and following the installation instructions here. So once Ember CLI is installed, we get this Ember command line tool that we can use to either bring up a server or generate controllers or views or components, etc. So it's a whole range of commands that we can make Ember CLI perform for us. So what we're going to do now is going to create a new project. So we're going to type in Ember new and then the name of our project, which is going to be Ember-Select2. So at this point, Ember CLI will download all the dependencies it needs. It takes a few minutes if you haven't run Ember new before. So it's downloaded all the packages via npm and browser packages via Bower, and it's initialized a Git repository for us. So if we now navigate into this new Ember Select2 directory, we can see that it's created a Brock file, an app directory where we're going to put all our source code, a bower.json file to configure Bower, a package.json file to configure our projects, as well as a testem.json file that we can use to configure our test environment. All of our code is going to go into this app directory, and as you see here, it's created a default app.js file, as well as directories for components, controllers, helpers, models, routes, templates, and views, as well as a directory where we can put our CSS style sheets. So now that we have our project initialized, we're going to install the third-party JavaScript libraries that we need via Bower. It's going to type Bower install --save, and we're going to bring in the Select2 library, and then we're going to bring in Bootstrap, as well as a library called Select2 Bootstrap. We're also going to need two plugins for the Broccoli build system. And we're going to need the Broccoli merge trees and the Broccoli static compiler plugins. I'm going to bring these in via npm. So npm install --save dev Broccoli merge trees, and the Broccoli static compiler. Like so. At this point, we're just going to try to build our application. So we're going to type in Ember build, and this will build our project and store it in the dist directory. So now it's time to open up our project into our favorite text editor. So I'm going to be using Sublime Text. So I'm going to open up my project. So I'll put it on my desktop, and I'm just going to place it like so. So the first thing we're going to do is to open up our Brock file. We're going to replace this app.toTree code here so that we can bring in our third-party libraries. So I'm going to copy and paste in my build script. So what we're doing here is we're starting up by requiring our two plugins that we installed via npm. And then we are going to use app.import to bring in the JavaScript and CSS for the Select2 component, as well as the pick files function that we get from this static compiler in order to bring in these three assets, these three images, also from the Select2 component. And then finally we are bringing in both Bootstrap and the Select2 Bootstrap CSS files. And at the end we have simply merging the app.toTree with this Select2 images tree here. And then I'm going to try to build. So now if we look inside our dist directory, we can see that our assets have been placed here. So we've added the three images, as well as all the JavaScript and CSS have been added to these vendor files here, Ember.js and vendor CSS. So at this point it's time to bring up our application so that we can start developing our component. So if you go into the command line and type Ember server, we're going to bring up a server that's going to host our application. And it's going to host it on port 4200 by default. So back in Chrome here, open a new tab and type localhost 4200. This is going to load up our new application. And currently it's empty, so it has a welcome text output to the website. So the first thing we want to do is to create the component. So we are going to use the Ember command line tool to do that. We're going to type Ember generate component. Now we need to name our component. I'm just going to call it select-2 because all Ember components needs to have a dash in them. So it's created three files. It created the component.js file for the component class, as well as the default handlebars templates for the component, and it's also created a stub for a test. So if we go back to our code now and open up the app directory and components, we can see that we have added a new component.js file here. It's just an empty component, and here it uses ECMAScript 6 notation. So this is the same as you would normally write as app.select2 component equals ember.component.extend. So this is the same as these three lines up here. So now that we have a component, we would like to add this component into our application. So we're going to go to the application template and just above outline here, we're going to output our component. Simply by using an expression with the component name in it. And this is going to render the component to the screen. But so far we haven't told the application what to render and how to render it. So I'm going to go back into the component here, and I'm going to set some default options so that our component can become an input field and it'll be styled appropriately. We use the tag name to override the default tag name, which is a div, and we want an input instead. And then we have a class name. So this is the CSS class name we want to append our components. We want to append the form control. This is the bootstrap class to make the input field as wide as the current view. Then we have a class name bindings, input size, and an attribute binding, which is going to bind to style. We could have inputted this directly into the class names here and attributes. This is just to show how we can bind our class names and attributes to the return value of properties on our components. So we're going to declare this input size property, which is simply going to be input-md to make it a bit taller. And the style attribute is simply going to be display hidden. Then in addition to these, we are going to declare some properties that we're going to use later in the components. So we have an option value path, which we can set to null. And we also have a placeholder, which we're going to set to null for now, and a multiple property, which we are going to set to true, which means that we can select more than one value. And finally, we have a did insert element function, and inside here we are going to initialize our component and set up all the properties for the component. So right now, if we save the file and make sure that Ember server is running, we can refresh the application, and we can see that we now have an output here, which is an input field. But so far we haven't really told this input field that we want this to be a select2 input field. So in order to do that, we're going to go back into our components, into the did insert element function. We're going to start up by creating a variable, which we're going to call self. I'm just going to put this into self, so that for any callbacks we might have inside this function, we still have a reference to this component via a property self. We're also going to declare an options object, and this is going to be the options and the configuration that we're going to send into the select2 component. And then finally, we are going to use this placeholder and multiple properties here to set this into options. So we can say options.placeholder equals self.get placeholder, and then options.multiple equals self.get multiple. Then we are going to declare this component to be a select2 component. So we are going to use the self.dollar to get a hold of the current view, and we're going to call the select2 function and pass it in the options. This is going to make our component into a select2 component. So we're going to make this text field here, input field, into a select2 component. And this select2 component here returns itself, so we're going to store that into a property called _select. This is so that we can refer to it later if you want to listen for actions or events that happen inside the select2 component. If we now go back to the application and try and bring up the console and refresh, we can see there that we have an uncaught query function not defined for the select2 component. And this is a requirement of the select2 component itself. that we need to define a query function for the options that we pass in. So we need to define this up here. So we can say options.query equals function. This gets a query as input. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to, for what we type into the text field, we are going to match it with the options that are already available, and then populate a list of results based on the term that we've inputted into the text field. Just going to create a reference to this at the top here. I'm going to create a variable called filtered content, which is going to be like so. It's going to get the content property of the controller, which we haven't set yet. It's going to set in a second. And I'll call the reduce function on that. And the reduce function gets a results array as well as the current item, like so. And in here we need to match if the current string we've typed into the text field match any of the items in this content array. We're going to say if select2.matcher, which is a matcher that's built into the select2 component. So we're going to match on query.term, and then we're going to use Ember get item ID. And if these match, we're going to push it onto this results array. Like so. And then we need to return this results down here. We need to declare an array as the second property here. And then we need to call the callback function of the query input parameter here. So query.callback results filtered contents. So we can save our file and go back to our application. Now we can see that we get a new error that we can't call reduce of undefined. And the reason for this is that we haven't really told our, we haven't given our component any content array yet. So in order to do this, we're going to go back to the application template, and we're going to say content equals model. But we haven't really given our application route any models either. So in order to do this, we're going to go into the routes directory. The Ember command line to do this. So we're going to say Ember new generate route application. So we chose not to override our application template, but we have now created an application route as well as a test for the application route. So I'm bring up the server again. Okay, so an error on line 27. So now we have an application route defined here. So I'm going to go into the model hook here. I'm going to give it some, I'm going to return some mock-up data here. So var items equals empty array, return items. We're simply here going to push a few items onto this items array by using push object. Ember.object.create ID red, ID red. I'm gonna create 4 of these, blue, pink, and white. So these are going to be our default options whenever we click on the text field. Now we go back to our application, click here. We still do get an error, and the reason for this is that the Select2 component here basically only works with strings. So by default it only has knowledge of strings. So we can fix that by telling it how to translate between our Ember objects, which are the 4 objects we created here, and the strings. So we can do that by creating a new function at the bottom here, called format item for select2. Just going to be a function that takes an item. And in here I'm just going to make a simple test, if not item. So I'm going to return. Here I'm simply going to say var text equals ember.get item ID. And then here I'm going to return ember.handlebars.utils.escape expression text. So what we do here is that we simply get the ID property of our items and return the texts that are inside our IDs. And the next thing we need to do is to add a couple of functions to this options object. I'm going to go and declare an options dot format selection. Which is equals and options.format results. Like so. And this format selection function will be called in order to format our selections, which are each of these selected items up here, and the results is the items that are inside our list. So here we're going to simply return self.format item for select and pass in the item. We can do that for both this function and this function here. So now we have we're able to, when we click on this field, we get our default options in the list here. We can select either one, or we can also type. We can match any of the terms that are already defined in the content array. So the next thing we want to do here is that we want to be able to add these items that are here that are selected into a selected array on our controller. And we want to be able to display our content and the selected property down here, or arrays down here. So first off, we're going to go into our controllers directory, and we're going to generate a new controller for the application route. I'm going to go back into the command line and type ember generate controller application. So we generated a class for the controller as well as the test for the controller. So in here, we want to define a selected array, which is all we're going to need for now. Then back in the application template, we want to pass this in. So that the component has access to this selected array. And finally, we want to print out the content of both the content array and the selected array. So here we simply print out, we iterate over each of the items in the content array, print out this item ID. We're going to add some actions here later. We'll remove them for now. And then we have we do the same for the selected array. Also we need to make sure that our application controller is an array controller, because we are returning a list of items into the model. So here we have the 4 items that we had in our content array, and then we want to, when we add items up here, we want them to appear in this selected array as well. One way to do that is to go back into our component, and then just after we've declared our input field to be a select2 component, we call it on function, which enables us to listen to events that happen inside the select2 component. And here we're going to listen to the select2 selecting event, which has a callback function, and once inside this function, in this action, we want to simply push the selected item onto the selected array. So we can do that by calling self.get, and then we're going to get the selected array. I'm going to call push objects with the choice that we've made from the select2 components. So now we can refresh. And if we add items up here now, we can see that once we add them, they are automatically added into this selected array as well. So now we are able to manipulate the outside context of the component by choosing items in the select2 component, but we're not yet able to delete them from the selected array. So we're going to add that first, and then we're going to enable these buttons here so we can externally manipulate the content of the select2 component up here. So we're going to go back into our component code. We're going to listen to another action on another event on the select2 components. So this time we're going to listen to the select2-removed, which also is a function that gets an event. And we're going to do the same here. We're going to get the selected array, but then we're going to call remove object instead of push object. I'm going to get the choice here as well, like so. So now we can go back into our browser. We can add a few items, and then when we delete them, we can see that they also get removed from the selected array down here. So the next thing we're going to do is going to add actions to these buttons down here, so that we can add it to the selected array, and then once changes happen to the selected array, we want to manually update the contents of the selected items in this select2 property here. So we're going to go into our application template. I'm going to bring back these two actions here. So we have an action select item that we're going to call when we click add, and then deselect item when we click on remove. So we're going to add these two actions here into our application controller. And in here we are simply going to add and remove them to the selected array up here. So I'm going to say this.get selected push object up here, the item, and then down here we are simply going to remove it again, like so. So we can go back into our application, and we can click these these buttons here and add them to the selected array, and we can also remove them here. But as you can see, nothing happens inside the component up here. So we need to make sure that whenever our selected array change, that we update this component up here. One way to do this is to go back into our components and then add an observer down here. So I'm going to say create a function called selected observer function, and we're going to prepend observes down here. Observes, and then here we're going to observe the length of the selected array. So whenever the length of our array change, we want this function to be called. And whenever the selected array change, we simply want to update the data property of the select2 component. I'm going to go this self dot underscore select select2. I'm going to change the data property, and we're simply going to get the selected array. So this ensures that whenever our selected array change externally from our component, that we update the data property of the select2 component. So we save this and go back to our browser. Now see that our component is kept in sync with our two arrays. So there's one little thing I want to add before we end this screencast. If you remember back to the beginning, we added a placeholder on the component, but we haven't actually placed a placeholder inside this component here. So as you can see in the select2 components, we have a placeholder property, and we put that placeholder onto the options object here. So what we want to do is to simply go back into the application template where we use our component, and then simply add a placeholder. So if you want to bind this placeholder to a property, we can say controller dot my placeholder, and then we need to define that in here. My placeholder component, like so. And when we go back here and refresh, you can see that our placeholder has been added. But we can also, instead of using a property here, we can also use a string. So I can line placeholder. But we have added a bug into our components. So if you go back here and click and select one of these, you see that the latest selection we made shows up twice in the list here. It's not selected twice, it just shows up twice here. And the reason for this is go back to the code here and look at the selected observer. Here we are updating the data properly so that we're adding all of our selections to the list here. But then after that happens, the component itself goes in and adds the ones you selected from the list here. So one quick way to fix this is to defer this here to a little bit later. So we do that by wrapping it in a later run loop. We say ember.run later. Like so. And we refresh now. You see that we get the behavior that we expected. And it's a good idea to add some comments when we add code like this, because it's not clear why we wrap this here in a run loop. Another option here would also be to schedule this action here into after render. Then we've created, we wrapped a fairly complex JQuery plugin. We're able to manipulate the data that we send in. So the two arrays that we send in, we can manipulate them inside the component and expose those to the rest of the application. And we're also able to change the state of the component from the outside by manipulating these two arrays as well. And you can see, obviously, here we've been able to add both blue and pink twice in the selected array here. So obviously for a production application we would have to add tests so that we only add one tag for each type here. And this can be done quite simply by adding checks into this function here. So it needs to be added both here and in the action in the controller. So one way would be to create a function in here that will return a boolean true or false, depending on if this item already exists in this list, for instance. And then you only add it if it's not there already.